This video is brought to you by Ground News. When you vote in a general election here in the UK, two things are certain. The BBC push notification about dogs at polling stations, and no matter how you vote, either the Conservatives or Labour will form a government. This has been the case for more than 100 years, barring a couple of exceptions where the government has either been a coalition or relied on smaller parties in supplying confidence agreements. However, that's not to say that this will be the case forever. There were signs in the election last year that the two-party system as we know it might be starting to crumble. So in this video, we're going to have a look at what these signs were, whether the signs still exist, and ultimately whether the UK is heading towards a multi-party system. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. It's worth starting this video by looking specifically at the 2024 general election. By far, this election was one of the best for small parties in British political history. As you likely already know, parties like the Lib Dems and the Greens achieved their highest seat share in their history. This is in addition to the new startup, Reform UK, garnering a very respectable 5 MPs. When we dig down a bit deeper into the numbers though, you start to realise just how unprecedented last year's election was. Back in 1951, the share of the vote won by the two main parties was 96.8%. By 2010, this had fallen to 65.1%, and by 2024 it had fallen to a mere 57.4%, the lowest in electoral history. Sure, along the way there were some outliers. In 2017, for instance, the two main parties won 82.3%, but on the whole, there's been a steady decline since the 50s. Conversely, the vote share of the smaller parties has been on the rise. 2024 saw the highest number of parties exceed 5% of the vote share, with the total coming to 5. Labour, the Tories, Reform UK, the Lib Dems and the Green Party, and the highest number of parties winning seats in Parliament, with the total coming to 11. All of this led to Labour winning the election with the smallest share of the vote, 35%, of any government with any parliamentary majority in British history. Just to be clear, if they won a majority of 1 with this same vote share, this still would have been the lowest share of the vote ever. The fact that they won such a large majority on this shockingly low vote share goes to show just how distorting first past the post can be. If, however, the election had been held using a proportional electoral system, for instance the additional member system used for the Scottish and Welsh Parliament elections, the results would have looked very different indeed. Labour would have fallen vastly short of a majority, with just 228 seats. The Tories would have won 139 seats, Reform 100 seats, the Lib Dems 73 seats, and the Greens 71 seats. In reality, this would have meant that Starmer would have had to have gone cap in hand not only to the Liberal Democrats, but also to the Greens, in order to secure enough seats to form a majority government. It's worth noting too that even in this scenario, Starmer would be governing with an even smaller majority than he currently has under the first past the post system. So it's clear that the election last year produced a particularly unfair result for the smaller parties that, at least on election day, the electorate expressed, more than ever before, a desire to move beyond the two-party system. But has this held up since? Well, the best way to find this out is to look at the opinion polls since the election. If anything, it looks like the UK has moved even further into multi-party territory. Since the election, Labour's polling has essentially collapsed, from around 35% immediately after the election in July last year to around 25% now. As a result of this, we've seen the other parties steadily climb in the polls. Both Reform UK and the Conservatives are now polling at a similar level to that of Labour, and in the last month, we've seen different polls showing each of them out in first place. We've also seen the Liberal Democrats polling also start to creep up, going from around 11 or 12% at the time of the election last year to around 15 or 16% now. Clearly, this indicates that voters are still willing to vote for other, smaller parties in a general election. In addition to this though, YouGov conducted polling in August last year to see whether people think the country would be worse off with only 2 parties in Parliament. Only 9% of respondents think that the UK would be better off. 52% though think the country would be worse off. So there's a fair amount of evidence to suggest that the UK may be done with the two-party system. There is though one major caveat to point out here though. It's not actually been that long since the last election. What we mean by this is that on occasion throughout British political history, we see a temporary tightening between a bunch of parties in the polls. The most recent example of this was prior to the 2019 general election, when the Conservatives, Labour, the Lib Dems and the Brexit Party were all polling similarly. With the news that Farage would step aside for the Conservatives, their polling collapsed and the Tories ended up winning. From then until essentially the election last year, the polling returned to being mainly split between Labour and the Conservatives. The point we're trying to make here is that there's a chance that the current state of polling is only temporary. It's hard to predict the future, especially in politics. All it would take is for Reform to tear themselves apart, or for either Labour or the Conservatives to gain a significant electoral asset, and we could very realistically go back to the days of only two parties dominating the polls. Now, as we said, it's hard to predict this, but there is at least one indicator in the near future that should show whether the two-party system will endure for at least a little while longer. The multitude of elections taking place on May the 1st. This will be a test of the multi-party nature of the UK. Specifically, all eyes will be on Reform and the Lib Dems to see whether they can translate their positive polling into actual political power. If they're able to, then it will demonstrate the momentum is with them, showing wealthy donors and local activists that their time isn't being wasted, thus perpetuating their positive polling. All in all though, while it does look like the two-party system is beginning to crumble, we'll need more sustained evidence of a multi-party system over a much longer time period before we can accurately conclude that the two-party system is dead and buried. There's a lot to unpack here though, with this story about Reform UK outperforming Labour in the polls being reported on by more than 19 sources. Interestingly, we can see that of those, 54% came from left-leaning outlets, while 38% came from outlets that lean right. Looking at the headlines, you can also see some differences, with left-leaning sources focusing on Labour's over-focus on Reform and right-leaning sources focusing on the bombshell nature of the polling. We're able to do that because of our sponsor Ground News, whose incredible website and app lets you discover the news and pulls back the curtain on media bias. Built by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news, with Ground News ingesting over 50,000 articles from all over the world, and then organising each by story. For each and every story, you can see the number of reporting sources, where these sources lean on the political spectrum at an individual level and group level, compare the headlines of each source, and read each article all without ever leaving the app. But one of the best parts of the app is their blind spot feed. It presents you with stories and articles that haven't been reported on by one side of the aisle or the other, helping you better break out of your media bubble and discover what those on the other side of the political spectrum are really saying. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape, and I think an app like this will only become more essential as the media landscape continues to evolve. If you're interested in everything that Ground News has to offer, you can get 40% off the unlimited Access Vantage plan using the link in the description or by scanning the QR code. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.